He raised his rifle at the Apache Girl, and in that moment he was certain of one thing. Trouble had finally found his ranch. The wind moved slowly across the Arizona Valley that morning, carrying the dry scent of sage and dust across the open range, and Daniel Whitmore stood beside the worn fence outside his small ranch house, watching a lone figure on the ridge nearly 200 yards away. She had appeared without warning, just a still shape against the pale sky, her dark hair lifting slightly in the breeze while the early sun turned the rocks around her the color of old copper. Out here a stranger never meant anything simple, and a lone Apache rider watching a ranch usually meant the beginning of a long and dangerous day. Daniel rested the stock of the rifle against his shoulder, his movements slow and careful, the same deliberate calm he had learned after years of working cattle across lonely miles of desert where mistakes could cost a man everything. The girl did not move when the rifle came up. That alone made his brow tighten beneath the brim of his hat. Most riders would turn away the moment they realized a rancher had noticed them. Most would vanish into the canyon trails and leave nothing behind but hoofprints and dust. But she remained exactly where she stood, balanced on the ridge as if the wind itself had carved her into the stone. Daniel narrowed his eyes, measuring the distance the way a rancher measures a coming storm, studying the small details that told stories out here where words rarely traveled. She carried no rifle, no bow that he could see. Only a worn leather satchel slung across one shoulder, and a small turquoise pendant catching flashes of light whenever the sun broke through the moving clouds. Something about the stillness felt wrong. Not threatening exactly, just wrong in the quiet way the desert sometimes warns a man before something changes. Daniel adjusted his stance and drew a steady breath. He had seen Apache scouts before, years earlier when the borderlands were rougher and the line between neighbor and enemy blurred with every passing season. Back then he had learned that silence could mean patience, and patience could mean danger. So he kept the rifle steady and watched her through the sights. For a long moment nothing happened. The valley stretched wide and empty around them, 5 miles of dry grassland broken only by scattered mesquite trees and the slow path of a narrow creek cutting through the earth like an old scar. Then the girl moved. Not away, not down the ridge toward the canyon trails. She stepped forward instead, one careful step at a time, her boots finding the path along the rocks as if she had already decided exactly where she was going. Daniel's grip tightened slightly around the rifle stock. The girl stopped halfway down the ridge. From there she could see the ranch house clearly, the old barn leaning slightly with age, the corral gate hanging open beside the watering trough where his horse drank quietly in the morning shade. For a moment, she simply looked at him. Even across the distance, he could feel the steadiness in her gaze. Not fear, not anger, something sharper, urgent. Then suddenly she raised one arm and shouted across the valley with a voice strong enough to cut through the wind. "Behind you." The words echoed off the canyon walls before Daniel even had time to understand them. Instinct turned his head first, long before reason could argue with what he had heard. And in that same second, he realized the quiet morning he thought he understood had already begun to change. Daniel turned just as the sound reached him, a sharp crack rolling across the valley like dry wood snapping in a fire. The sound did not come from the ridge where the Apache Girl stood. It came from somewhere behind the cottonwood trees near the creek, a place where the tall grass and shadows could hide more than a man expected to find on a quiet morning. Daniel lowered his rifle slightly and took one step away from the fence, his boots pressing into the dry soil while his eyes searched the open land with the careful patience that years of ranch work had taught him. Nothing moved at first. Only the slow sway of grass in the wind and the distant creak of the barn door shifting against its hinge. But the girl on the ridge had not run. She had not disappeared into the canyon the way most travelers would when trouble appeared. Instead, she had begun moving down the slope faster now, her boots sliding over loose stone as she hurried toward the valley floor with a focus that carried none of the hesitation Daniel had expected from someone crossing unfamiliar land. Daniel lifted the rifle again and turned back toward the creek. The warning echoed in his thoughts more clearly now. "Behind you." The words had not sounded like a threat. They had sounded like urgency. And urgency out here almost always meant someone had already made a plan. A faint shape appeared between the cottonwoods then, far enough away that it could have been a shadow if Daniel had not already been watching. A horse stepped into the sunlight. then another. Riders. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came when a quiet morning suddenly revealed how many things a man had missed. 3 horses emerged slowly from the shade of the trees and stopped near the creek bank, their riders sitting tall in the saddles as they studied the ranch house, the barn, the corral, and finally the lone rancher standing beside the fence. Daniel had never seen them before, but he understood enough about the West to recognize the look of men who had come a long distance with a purpose that had nothing to do with buying cattle or asking directions. Dust clung to their coats, and the horses shifted restlessly as if the animals themselves sensed the tension stretching across the valley. Daniel glanced back toward the ridge for just a second. The Apache Girl was already halfway down the slope now, moving quickly but carefully, her eyes fixed on the riders near the creek rather than on the rifle pointed in her direction only moments earlier. That was when Daniel realized something that made the quiet air feel heavier than before. She had not come to spy on him. She had been watching the creek, watching the riders, watching the danger that had been sitting there long before he noticed it. Daniel lowered the rifle another inch, not out of trust, but out of understanding that the morning had just grown more complicated than he had believed. The riders near the creek had not spoken yet. They simply waited, their horses shifting in the dust while the wind carried the faint smell of river water and sun-baked earth across the valley. Daniel could feel the moment stretching thin between them, like the silence before a storm when every living thing pauses to see which direction the wind will choose. Then the girl reached the bottom of the ridge and stopped 20 yards away from him, breathing steady despite the quick descent. For the first time Daniel could see her clearly. Her eyes held no anger, only a sharp alertness that seemed older than her years. She looked at him once, then toward the riders near the creek, and spoke quietly but firmly. They followed the canyon trail all night. They are not here for water. Daniel studied her for a long second before looking back toward the creek again. The riders had begun moving forward now, their horses stepping slowly through the tall grass as the distance between them and the ranch narrowed yard by yard beneath the rising desert sun. The riders continued forward at an unhurried pace, their horses stepping through the dry grass with the steady rhythm of men who knew exactly where they were going. Daniel Whitmore remained beside the fence, the rifle still in his hands though no longer raised to his shoulder. He watched them carefully, the way a rancher watches a storm building on the horizon, measuring distance, studying posture, reading the quiet language of the frontier that most people never learn to see. 20 yards away the Apache Girl stood with her back to the wind, her eyes never leaving the riders near the creek. The turquoise pendant at her neck caught the morning sun each time she turned her head slightly, flashing small bursts of light like signals between the dust and sky. Daniel noticed it now more clearly than before, though he could not yet place why the color felt familiar. The riders crossed the shallow edge of the creek and guided their horses toward the open ground of the valley. From here Daniel could see more details. Their coats were dark with trail dust, their hats pulled low against the glare of the rising sun, and the way they sat their saddles carried the relaxed confidence of men who believed the land ahead of them already belonged to them. That kind of confidence rarely came from travelers looking for water. It came from people who had followed a trail long enough to believe the end of it was close. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, the old boards of the fence creaking beside him. He spoke without looking at the girl. "How long have they been behind me?" The Apache Girl answered quietly, her voice steady and clear. "Since yesterday afternoon." Daniel turned his head then, studying her more carefully. "You followed them all night." She nodded once. The canyon paths carry sound. Their horses were not careful. The riders were still moving forward, closing the distance yard by yard, the soft thud of hooves becoming easier to hear as the valley slowly filled with the warmth of morning. Daniel counted them again. 3 men, 3 horses. That alone was enough to trouble him. Small groups often meant quiet plans rather than loud ones. He lowered the rifle until the barrel pointed toward the ground, though he did not release his grip. If they were after cattle, they would have come with more riders. If they wanted water, they would have stopped at the creek. The fact that they kept coming meant the ranch itself was their destination. Daniel glanced once more at the girl beside him. "Why warn me?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied the riders for another moment, as if measuring the same details Daniel had already begun to notice. The sun climbed higher above the valley ridge, casting long pale light across the grass, and turning the distant canyon walls the color of weathered copper. Finally she spoke. Because they are not looking for cattle. Daniel frowned slightly. Then what are they looking for? The girl met his eyes then, and in that quiet moment Daniel felt the strange certainty that she already understood more about the situation than he did. One of them carries a map, she said slowly. I heard them speaking last night. They believe something valuable is hidden here. Daniel felt the words settle in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He had lived on this ranch for 7 years. Long enough to know every fence post, every bend in the creek, every patch of stubborn desert grass that survived the summer heat. Nothing valuable had ever been buried here except hard work and quiet days. Yet the riders continued forward as if the land itself had promised them something worth the journey. Daniel looked toward the creek again. The distance between them had closed to less than 100 yards now. The lead rider finally slowed his horse and raised his head slightly, his eyes studying the ranch house, the barn, and the lone man waiting by the fence. The valley fell into a deeper silence then, the kind that arrives when every person involved understands that the next few minutes may change the shape of the entire day. Beside Daniel, the Apache girl rested one hand lightly against the leather satchel at her side, and spoke one more quiet sentence that carried the calm certainty of someone who had already seen the path ahead. They believe the map will lead them to silver hidden somewhere on this land. Daniel looked across the valley once more, then slowly shook his head beneath the brim of his hat. I have been digging fence posts here for 7 years, he said. If silver is buried on this ranch, it has been hiding better than anything I have ever seen. The riders stopped about 80 yards from the fence, their horses forming a quiet line across the sunlit grass, while the valley held its breath around them. Daniel Whitmore remained where he stood beside the weathered boards, the rifle resting low in his hands, his eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. The Apache girl stood a few steps to his right, close enough now that he could hear the calm rhythm of her breathing over the wind moving through the tall grass. None of the riders spoke at first. They studied the ranch the way men study land they believe already belongs to them. One of them finally nudged his horse forward a few yards, the animal stepping carefully across the uneven ground until the rider sat just ahead of the other two. He was older than Daniel expected, perhaps 40 years or more, with a long trail coat and the patient posture of someone used to being listened to. His eyes moved slowly from the barn to the corral, then to the house, and finally settled on Daniel himself. Morning, rancher, the man called across the open ground, his voice carrying easily through the quiet air. Daniel did not step forward or raise the rifle again. Morning. The man studied him for a moment longer, then let his gaze shift briefly toward the Apache girl standing beside him. Something unreadable crossed his expression before he returned his attention to Daniel. Quiet place you have here. Daniel nodded once. That is the idea. The rider smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. We are looking for something that might be buried nearby. Daniel felt the words settle into the silence exactly as the girl had predicted only moments earlier. He glanced briefly toward her before looking back at the rider. This ranch has a lot of dirt, he said evenly. Most of it holds nothing but fence posts and stubborn weeds. The rider rested one gloved hand on the saddle horn as if the conversation were nothing more than two travelers discussing the weather. That may be true, he said, but sometimes men hide things in places that look ordinary. Daniel did not answer right away. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of warm earth and creek water across the valley. The Apache girl spoke quietly then, her voice low enough that only Daniel could hear it. They believe the map tells them where to dig. Daniel kept his eyes on the riders. Maps can be wrong. The lead rider tilted his head slightly as if he had heard something interesting in the silence between Daniel and the girl. He reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it loosely in one hand where the sunlight revealed the edges of old creases and faded ink. We followed a trail through 3 valleys and 1 dry canyon to reach this place, he said. That kind of journey usually ends somewhere important. Daniel studied the paper from a distance, noticing the worn edges and the careful way the man held it, as though the fragile thing carried more weight than it should. 7 years ago, Daniel Whitmore had bought this land from a tired rancher who wanted to move east. The old man had left him a cracked barn, a broken windmill, and a handful of cattle that knew the valley better than any map ever could. In all that time, Daniel had never seen silver in the soil, never heard a rumor worth chasing across half the territory. Yet the riders sat there as if the land itself had promised them something hidden beneath the quiet grass. The Apache girl stepped slightly closer to Daniel and spoke again without raising her voice. "They will not leave easily." Daniel nodded once. "I can see that." Across the valley, the lead rider folded the paper carefully and slipped it back inside his coat. Then he leaned forward in the saddle, just enough for his voice to carry clearly across the remaining distance. "We will search the land today, rancher. It will go quicker if you show us where to start." The words hung in the morning air, while the valley remained silent except for the slow creak of the barn door behind Daniel and the restless shifting of horses in the grass. The lead rider's words drifted across the valley and settled into the quiet air like dust after a long ride. And for a moment, Daniel Whitmore did not answer. He simply stood beside the fence and watched the three horses shifting in the grass while the morning sun climbed higher above the canyon rim. 7 years of working this land had taught him that silence often said more than quick words, and right now the valley seemed to be waiting to see which direction the day would take. The Apache girl stood beside him with the same steady calm she had shown since reaching the valley floor. Daniel noticed that she had not once looked frightened. Alert, yes. Careful, certainly. But not afraid. That alone made him realize how differently she understood the situation compared to the way he had first judged her from the ridge. The riders remained where they were, their horses stamping lightly in the dry grass as the wind shifted through the valley. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice carrying easily across the open ground. "This land is not public ground." The rider sitting in front tilted his head slightly, as if he had expected that answer. "Perhaps not," he said calmly. "But we have traveled a long distance following that map, and the map says the trail ends here." Daniel rested both hands on the top rail of the fence, the rifle now hanging loosely in his grip. Maps have a habit of lying to people who trust them too much. One of the riders behind the leader shifted in his saddle and glanced toward the barn as though measuring the distance to the building and the corral beyond it. The lead rider noticed the movement and lifted a hand slightly, a quiet signal for patience. Then he looked back toward Daniel. "We are not here to cause trouble, rancher. We only want to look around." The Apache girl spoke softly beside Daniel, her eyes still fixed on the riders. "They believe the map shows a silver deposit." Daniel answered without turning his head. "If there was silver here, the old rancher who sold me this place would have taken it with him." The rider allowed himself a small smile at that. "Sometimes men hide things even from themselves," he said. The valley fell silent again. Somewhere near the creek, a hawk circled slowly in the bright sky, its shadow gliding across the grass as the wind carried the smell of warm earth and distant water through the air. Daniel considered the situation carefully. 3 riders, confident enough to ride straight across his valley and ask permission only after arriving. A map they believed strongly enough to follow through miles of rough country. And beside him, a girl who had tracked them all night simply to give him a warning he had almost ignored. Daniel finally pushed himself away from the fence and took a few slow steps forward, stopping halfway between the riders and the house. "If you are planning to search this land," he said, "you should know something first." The lead rider watched him with quiet interest. "And what is that?" Daniel looked across the valley once more, then gestured toward the rocky hills rising beyond the far pasture. "That land out there has broken more shovels than any rancher I have ever known. The ground is stone under the topsoil, hard enough that even fence posts take half a day to set." The rider followed Daniel's gesture toward the hills, his expression thoughtful. "Hard ground sometimes hides valuable things," he replied. Daniel shrugged slightly. "Then you are welcome to try your luck digging it." The rider studied him for another long moment, as if trying to decide whether the rancher standing before him was telling the truth or simply protecting something worth far more than a quiet cattle ranch. Behind Daniel, the Apache girl shifted her weight and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. "They are not sure yet if you are lying." Daniel kept his eyes on the riders. "Neither am I sure what they expect to find." The lead rider finally guided his horse one step forward and rested his hands calmly on the saddle horn. "Then I suppose we will all find out together," he said. And with that the riders began moving again, slowly crossing the valley toward the ranch, while the quiet morning stretched thin with the promise that something hidden beneath the land was about to pull every one of them deeper into its story. The three riders crossed the last stretch of open grass slowly, their horses stepping through the sunlight until they reached the edge of Daniel Whitmore's fence line. Up close, the dust on their coats showed the long miles they had traveled, and the leather of their saddles carried the worn look of men who spent more time on the trail than in any town. Daniel stood a few yards in front of the gate now, his posture calm, though every instinct in him remained alert. The Apache Girl stayed just behind his left shoulder, close enough that he could sense the quiet steadiness in the way she watched the riders without once lowering her guard. The lead rider guided his horse to a stop beside the fence and studied the ranch more carefully than before. The barn leaned slightly toward the east where the wind had pushed against its boards for years. The corral held 2 horses and a handful of cattle grazing lazily in the pasture beyond. It looked exactly like what it was, a small ranch carved out of stubborn land by a man who had chosen quiet over trouble. Yet the rider's eyes moved across the ground as if he expected something else to reveal itself beneath the grass. He finally looked back toward Daniel. "Mind if we take a closer look around your place?" Daniel rested his forearms on the top rail of the fence and considered the question. "You are already close enough to see everything important." The rider allowed a faint smile. "Sometimes the important things are buried." The Apache Girl spoke quietly from behind Daniel. "They believe the map shows a mark near water." Daniel glanced toward the creek cutting across the valley about 200 yards away. The water there ran shallow most of the year, nothing more than a slow ribbon moving through stone and sand. He had crossed it hundreds of times while checking cattle and never once thought of it as anything more than a convenient watering spot. The lead rider noticed Daniel's glance and nodded slightly. "That creek looks like the place the map describes." Daniel straightened slowly from the fence and looked across the valley toward the water. "If you want to see the creek," he said calmly, "you do not need my permission." The rider tilted his head again, studying Daniel with renewed interest. "You are either very confident, rancher, or very certain there is nothing here to find." Daniel shrugged once. "After 7 years on this land, I would be surprised if it suddenly decided to reveal treasure." One of the other riders chuckled quietly under his breath, though the sound held more curiosity than mockery. The lead rider turned slightly in his saddle and gestured toward the creek. "Let us see what the ground has to say." The 3 horses began walking again, their hooves moving through the tall grass toward the water while Daniel and the Apache Girl watched from the fence line. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the soft sound of the creek across the valley along with the distant cry of the hawk still circling high above. The girl finally stepped beside Daniel and looked toward the water where the riders were approaching the bank. "If they find nothing, they will wonder if the map is wrong." Daniel nodded slowly. "And if they find something?" The girl did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied the land the same way she had studied the riders earlier that morning. The creek curved around a cluster of smooth stones before disappearing into a narrow canyon trail that wound through the hills beyond the pasture. Finally, she spoke in a calm voice that carried a quiet certainty. "Then this quiet valley will not stay quiet for long." Daniel followed her gaze toward the water and felt the strange weight of possibility settle into the still morning air as the riders dismounted beside the creek and began studying the ground, like men convinced that the earth beneath their boots held a secret waiting to be uncovered. The 3 riders crouched near the edge of the creek, studying the ground with careful attention, their horses grazing quietly a few yards away while the slow current slipped between smooth stones and patches of sand. From the fence line, Daniel Whitmore could see them tracing shapes in the dirt, comparing the bends of the water to the folded map that the lead rider had removed once again from his coat. The sun had climbed higher now, warming the valley and burning away the thin morning haze that had lingered along the canyon walls. Beside Daniel, the Apache Girl remained still, her eyes following every movement near the creek as though she were reading a story written across the earth. Daniel folded his arms along the fence rail and watched in silence. He had worked cattle through every corner of this valley for years, and yet the riders searched the ground with a kind of certainty that made him wonder if he had overlooked something hidden beneath the quiet routine of ranch life. The lead rider finally stood and turned slowly in a full circle, measuring the distance between the creek bank and the rocky hills beyond the pasture. He pointed toward a cluster of large stones where the water curved around a narrow bend before disappearing toward the canyon trail. The other 2 riders moved closer to the spot and began brushing away loose sand with their boots, studying the ground beneath, as if the shape of the earth itself might confirm what the map promised. Daniel glanced toward the girl beside him. They looked convinced. She nodded slightly. Men who ride that far with a map do not usually doubt it. Daniel looked back toward the creek. The riders were kneeling now beside the cluster of stones, clearing small patches of dirt and examining the surface beneath with quiet concentration. The wind carried the faint sound of their voices across the valley, though the words themselves were too distant to understand. One of the riders stood and pointed toward the canyon trail behind them, then toward the bend in the water again. The lead rider unfolded the map carefully and held it against the sunlight, comparing the paper to the land stretching around them. Daniel watched the scene unfold and felt a slow uneasiness settle into his thoughts. For 7 years this valley had been nothing more than cattle, dust, wind, and the steady rhythm of quiet work. The idea that something valuable might be hidden beneath the soil had never crossed his mind before today. The Apache girl stepped away from the fence and walked a few paces into the grass, her gaze fixed on the creek bank. Daniel noticed the turquoise pendant at her throat again as the sunlight caught its surface. The color flashed in a way that stirred a distant memory he could not quite grasp. He looked at it more closely now. That necklace, he said quietly. Where did you get it? The girl touched the pendant with one hand and looked back toward him. It belonged to my grandmother. Daniel frowned slightly. I have seen one like it before. The girl studied him with quiet curiosity. Where? Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the creek again where the riders had begun clearing a larger patch of earth beside the stones. Then the memory arrived slowly, like a trail appearing through dust. Many years ago, he said carefully, I helped an old healer during a winter storm near the Chiricahua Hills. She wore a necklace with the same turquoise stone. The girl's expression changed slightly, not with surprise, but with recognition. My grandmother was a healer there, she said softly. Daniel felt the connection settle between them with the quiet weight of something long forgotten, returning at exactly the moment it was needed. Before he could respond, a voice from the creek suddenly called across the valley. The lead rider stood near the stones holding something in his hand, his posture straight with a new excitement that carried clearly even from a distance. The men beside him leaned closer as he brushed the last layer of dirt from the object he had uncovered. From the fence Daniel could see the flash of dull metal catching the sunlight for a brief moment before the rider lifted his head and looked directly toward the ranch house, as if the earth itself had just confirmed the promise written on that fragile old map. The shout from the creek carried across the valley with a sharp excitement that did not belong to quiet ranch land, and Daniel Whitmore straightened slowly beside the fence as the 3 riders gathered closer around the patch of earth near the stones. The lead rider held something small between his fingers, turning it toward the sunlight as if the metal itself needed to prove it was real. Even from 200 yards away Daniel could see the dull yellow glint catching the morning light before disappearing again in the rider's palm. The 2 other men leaned closer, their attention fixed on the object as though the long journey across canyon trails and dry valleys had suddenly become worth every mile. The wind shifted gently across the grass while the creek continued its slow whisper through the stones, and for a moment the valley held the strange feeling of a secret that had finally stepped into daylight. Beside Daniel, the Apache girl watched the scene without moving, her dark eyes following the men near the water with the same steady calm she had shown since the morning began. Daniel rested one hand on the fence rail and spoke quietly. Looks like your riders found something after all. The girl nodded once, though her expression carried no surprise. The map was not lying, she said. Daniel kept his gaze on the creek. The lead rider stood now, raising the small metal object again before sliding it carefully into his pocket as though it were only the first piece of something larger still hidden beneath the soil. One of the other riders pointed toward the ground beside the stones and began clearing away more dirt with his boot, while the third man walked slowly along the edge of the creek, studying the land as if he expected the earth to reveal more clues with every step. Daniel felt a quiet weight settle in his chest. 7 years of quiet work had never given him reason to think the valley held anything more than grass and cattle, yet now 3 strangers stood beside his creek convinced that the land carried something valuable enough to cross half the territory for. The Apache girl finally stepped away from the fence and moved a few yards closer to the open pasture, her eyes still fixed on the riders. Daniel followed her with his gaze. "You seem less surprised than I am," he said. She answered calmly. "My grandmother used to say that the land remembers things people forget." Daniel looked back toward the creek. The riders had begun digging slowly with a small shovel pulled from one saddle, clearing dirt from the narrow space between the stones while the lead rider watched carefully with the folded map held open in his hand. Every movement carried the quiet determination of men who believed they were standing exactly where they were meant to be. Daniel leaned his shoulder lightly against the fence and exhaled slowly. "If there really is silver buried out there," he said, "this valley is about to change more than I ever planned." The girl turned her head slightly toward him. "It already has." Daniel followed her gaze again toward the creek where the riders continued working, their voices drifting faintly across the grass as the sun climbed higher and brightened the entire valley. The lead rider suddenly stopped the man digging and crouched beside the stones himself, brushing away more dirt with his hands before pausing as though he had uncovered something larger beneath the surface. Even from the fence, Daniel could see the tension in the way the men leaned forward together. The rider slowly lifted another object from the ground, heavier this time, and the sunlight struck it with a brighter flash that traveled across the water and into the open valley like a signal no one could ignore. The Apache girl watched quietly, and then spoke a sentence that carried the calm certainty of someone who understood what discoveries like that could awaken in men who believed fortune was only a shovel's depth away. "Now they will not leave this place easily," she said, and Daniel Whitmore looked across his quiet ranch and realized that whatever lay buried beside that creek had just changed the story of the entire valley. The bright flash of metal beside the creek did not fade quickly from Daniel Whitmore's thoughts, and for several long minutes, he stood beside the fence watching the riders work near the stones while the quiet valley slowly adjusted to the idea that something valuable might truly lie beneath its soil. The lead rider carefully placed the newly uncovered piece beside the first small object they had found earlier, both items resting on a flat stone where the sunlight could strike them clearly. Even from the distance, Daniel could now see the shape more clearly. The larger piece looked like part of an old mining marker, a weathered fragment of metal stamped long ago with numbers and faint lettering that time had nearly erased. The rider studied it closely, comparing the marks to the map in his hand while the other two men continued brushing away dirt around the base of the stones. The Apache girl stood quietly in the grass beside Daniel, her eyes steady as she watched the discovery unfold. The wind moved softly across the valley, bending the tall grass and carrying the distant sound of the creek toward the ranch house. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel finally rested his elbows on the fence rail again and let out a slow breath. "If that marker means what they think it means," he said, "then this land was part of an old claim long before I ever bought it." The girl nodded slightly. "Many claims were abandoned when the mines closed. Sometimes the land remembers them even when people do not." Daniel watched the riders carefully. The lead man folded the map again and slipped it back into his coat, then stood and looked across the valley toward the ranch house. For a moment his gaze met Daniel's across the wide stretch of grass. The rider lifted one hand slightly in a quiet gesture of acknowledgement, not a threat and not quite a greeting either, simply the silent signal of a man who understood that the discovery had changed the meaning of the land they now shared. Daniel returned the gesture with a small nod. The three riders gathered their tools and mounted their horses once more, guiding the animals slowly along the creek bank as they continued studying the ground toward the canyon trail. They had not found a silver vein yet, only a sign that one might once have existed somewhere beneath the valley. But the certainty in their posture made it clear they would return with more time and more tools to learn what the earth was still hiding. Daniel watched them ride along the water for several minutes before turning back toward the pasture. The Apache girl followed his gaze and then looked toward the distant hills where the canyon path disappeared into shadow. "You understand now why they came so far?" she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "And I understand why you followed them all night to warn me." She met his eyes calmly. "My grandmother believed that kindness travels farther than people expect." Daniel looked again at the turquoise pendant resting against her chest, and the memory of that winter storm years ago returned clearly at last. He had helped an old healer reach shelter during a freezing night near the mountains. She had thanked him with quiet dignity, and worn a turquoise stone very much like the one the girl carried now. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. Your grandmother once told me that the land tests the character of the people who live on it. The girl smiled faintly at those words. She still believes that. The valley grew quiet again as the riders disappeared along the bend of the creek, and the wind carried the smell of warm earth across the pasture. Daniel Whitmore looked across his ranch and realized that the land beneath his boots might hold secrets he had never expected to uncover. But he also understood something else now. The girl he had first seen as a stranger on the ridge had crossed miles of desert simply to give him a warning that might have changed everything. Out here in the wide country of the West, Daniel thought, sometimes the person you believe is a threat is the one who arrives first when the land begins to reveal the truth.